The strawberry moon. It doesn't turn pink, it doesn't turn red. June's full moon looks exactly like every other full moon, but Algonquin tribes named it after wild strawberries, which ripened and were ready to pick during the same short window every year. Other cultures called it the rose moon or the hot moon. Strawberry moon is just the one that stuck, mostly because the Farmer's Almanac printed it more than the others. The blue moon. In 1946, an amateur astronomer misread an old almanac and published a definition. The second full moon in a calendar month was called a blue moon. It wasn't, but the error spread through a radio broadcast, got locked in by a Trivial Pursuit question in 1986, and stuck. The underlying mechanic is real. The lunar cycle runs slightly shorter than a calendar month, so what is usually 12 full moons a year, or one per month, ends up being 13 full moons in a year, and 1 month ends up with 2, about every 2 or 3 years. But once in a blue moon is centuries older than any of that. In 16th century English, calling something a blue moon meant it was impossible, similar to when pigs fly. Over time, it shifted to just mean rare, the supermoon. Picture the moon's orbit as slightly lopsided, not a perfect circle. Some months it swings closer to Earth than others. When a full moon happens to land on that closest pass, called perigee, it can look up to 14% bigger and 30% brighter than usual. Astronomers didn't coin this term, by the way. An astrologer did, back in the late 1970s, and scientists have grudgingly used it ever since, mostly because regular people can actually see the difference with their own eyes. The blood moon. A total lunar eclipse. Earth passes directly between the sun and the moon, and instead of going dark, the moon turns deep red. Sunlight filtering through Earth's atmosphere scatters away the blue wavelengths and bends the red and orange ones around the planet, landing directly on the lunar surface. The same physics behind a sunset, scaled up and projected onto the moon. Astronomers calculate eclipse dates well in advance, so a blood moon is never a surprise to those tracking it. To everyone else looking up without warning, it very well could be. The harvest moon. Forget the calendar month. This one follows the equinox. Whichever full moon lands closest to the start of autumn earns the title, whether that's September or October. Here's what actually mattered about it. For a few nights around the equinox, the moon rises only about 20 minutes later each night instead of the usual 50. That's extra moonlight, several nights running, right after sunset. For farmers working without electricity, that gap meant a few more hours each evening to bring crops in before frost hit. The wolf moon. January's full moon. The name comes from Celtic and Old English tradition, carried to North America by European settlers who had long associated the dead of winter with the sound of wolves calling through the dark. It stuck, and most of the world knows it by that name today. Old folklore assumed the howling came from hunger, packs driven to desperation by the cold. That turns out to be wrong. Wolves howl year-round to locate each other, mark territory, and coordinate hunts. In January, the breeding season approaches and activity within the pack intensifies, which makes the calls more frequent and more audible across frozen, leafless ground. The pink moon. Not the moon's color, the flowers. Wild ground phlox, sometimes called moss pink, blooms early across North America right around April, turning entire fields a soft pink just as this full moon appears. Algonquin tribes named the moon after the bloom, not the sky. Look up during a pink moon, and you'll see the same pale white-gray it always is. The name is a calendar marker borrowed from the ground, not a description of what's overhead. The hunter's moon. The harvest moon's follow-up act, usually landing in October or November. Same trick with the moonlight. Bright, early rising, several nights in a row. But the job changed. Crops were already in. Fields were cleared. This was when hunters tracked game across that open, recently stripped land, using the extra light to stock up before winter made hunting harder. Practical naming, through and through. The lunar phases. The moon produces no light of its own. Everything you see is reflected sunlight, and how much of it reaches your eyes depends entirely on where the moon sits in its orbit at any given moment. The cycle runs from new moon, completely dark, the lit side facing away from us, through the growing crescent, the half-lit first quarter, the nearly full waxing gibbous, and finally the full moon, when Earth sits between the sun and the moon and the entire visible face lights up at once. Then it reverses. Waning gibbous, last quarter, waning crescent, dark again. The full loop takes roughly 29.5 days, consistent enough that most of the world's earliest calendars were built around it.